What might a Biden presidency mean for labor and employment law? It seems a near certainty that Biden has won the 2020 election despite less than spectacular turnout down ticket for Democrats. Early speculation has begun how a Democratic administration might shape various policy areas. Labor and employment law are no exception to the speculation. Democrats typically are considered more labor-friendly and advance, at least mildly, pro-employee law. Remembering Trump's labor and employment law policy. Honestly, not much can be said about Trump's labor and employment law policy over the past 4 years. The administration stocked administrative positions with Republican allies but otherwise made very little movement towards dismantling federal labor law or employment law. Certainly we could point to a few examples, but mostly the Trump administration continued its normal modus operandi of not doing much at all. A pessimistic view of the administration may consider the administration too lazy to have done more, leaving actual policymaking to Senate Republicans and the handful of more motivated participants. An optimistic view may point out that the administration understood a substantial part of its base comes from blue-collar workers who might be lost watching the administration take aggressive and apparent moves to dismantle job protections. Instead, the administration's labor and employment law legacy will come in the way of indirect effects. The Trump administration's long-term impact on labor and employment law will likely be felt over decades, with the appointment of several young conservative Supreme Court justices who have and will maintain a pro-employer bench. The tax cuts passed during the Trump administration will likely continue to have a negative effect for most employees. The tax cuts promised job and wage growth but turned into the predicted payday for stockholders as companies used newly liberated financial resources for stock buybacks. Over the long term, the decapitalization of businesses will require companies to oppress increased employee compensation and force reductions in force, especially as COVID continues to put pressure on many service-based industries. What may influence Biden's labor and employment law policy? The traditional Democratic base is considered what are often called special interests by the right: people of color, unions, women, environmentalists, urban dwellers, academia and college-educated voters. Biden campaigned hard in union-heavy states like Pennsylvania and Michigan but made little open promise to do anything for union workers or lower-paid workers in general. Unions fought hard to campaign for him and become a participant in his administration. However, even through the campaign, Biden has surrounded himself with people with an even worse record towards worker rights. Biden's voting record is not endearing. He voted for NAFTA and the TPP along with the 2005 bankruptcy bill that severely punished working people for debts while making it easier for business interests to wipe out their own. Right-wing media outlets from the Hill and onward might want to depict Biden as some socialist, labor extremist, but that would be an about-face for a politician with nearly 50 years of contrary experience. As discussed above, the Biden administration has fewer debts to pay to labor and working people than perhaps any Democratic president in the past 100 years. Biden could prove this wrong and pay his debts in the way of strong nominations to the EEOC, NLRB and federal judiciary. He could champion minimum wage increases and all his other labor and employment law campaign promises, but there is little to suggest that is going to happen. Wage issues. The Biden campaign supported pro-employee wage policies, but signs are not promising we will see much movement in the next 4 years. Biden mildly campaigned in favor of a minimum wage increase to $15 per hour, but this was never much of a component of the campaign. Biden has never been a significant advocate of increasing minimum wage, and if he governs to a coalition of Republican voters, it is unlikely that will occur. Democrats have not been especially vocal at the federal level on minimum wage increases in more than a decade, when minimum wage increased to $7.25 under a 2007 law. Biden also claims support for the Paycheck Fairness Act, which would strengthen the Equal Pay Act by narrowing the reasons why an employer can have disparate compensation between the sexes. Democrats may press to pass this law early in Biden's term so they can point to a pro-worker accomplishment for the next 4 years. Labor rights. Biden historically has talked up unions and worker rights despite not doing much about it in his long political career. We should expect some small acts by the administration, but there is little historical evidence that Biden intends to expend the political capital necessary to strengthen organized labor. The proposed PRO Act would accomplish this goal. Biden claims support for the legislation on the campaign trail, but moving on it as president will take more than writing support on a campaign website. Biden will have to overcome the GOP majority in the Senate, which seems unlikely to want to pass legislation designed to help a traditionally important Democratic support structure. Pregnancy discrimination. In September, the House passed the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, which would require employers to make reasonable accommodations for pregnancy and childbirth similar to those required by the Americans with Disabilities Act. Much like the Paycheck Fairness Act, this may pass the GOP Senate. Employment security. As a longtime ally of business interests, Biden is unlikely to do much to reverse the mostly bipartisan assault of worker rights over the past several decades. He is unlikely to spend the political capital to champion a reversal of Republican tax cuts or support any green initiatives that risk business interests that might in turn lose his newly found base of Republicans. With a looming economic collapse due to college and housing debt, Biden is unlikely to do much to help workers protect themselves from the inevitable waves of unemployment.